Hey everybody, thanks for watching. We're going to take a look at Luke chapter 12 verses 49 through 53, which is the gospel reading for this coming Sunday. Now, I often jokingly refer to the New Testament as the inspired commentary on the Old Testament, but that's actually the truth. What we have in the New Testament is the Old Testament explained, fulfilled. We have it expanded because there's all sorts of layers that we have in the Old Testament that build up and finally come to their fulfillment in the work of Christ. So to understand the New Testament apart from the Old Testament is like trying to read the last two chapters of a novel without knowing the previous chapters, or to watch the last 5 minutes of a movie without watching the previous hour and 55 minutes of the movie. So we need the Old Testament in order to understand exactly what's happening in the Gospels, because this is the background, the layered background that we have for all the Old Testament, for all the New Testament stories. And this certainly is the case in Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 53, because we have various Old Testament images and verses that are pulled together in this teaching of Jesus in order to depict this judgment that is to come. So we're going to look at some various Old Testament texts from Genesis to Micah to the Psalms. We're also going to take a look at a couple of New Testament Jewish texts in order to help us understand what Jesus is communicating. So he starts out by saying that he's come to cast fire on the earth and how he wishes it were already kindled, but he has a baptism with which to be baptized, and he's distressed until this is accomplished. So right away we have a couple of Old Testament images that are put before us: fire and water. The very first Greek word in verse 49 is fire. It's put at the beginning of the verse in order to impress this image upon us. So fire, Jesus says, fire I've come to cast upon the earth. And then he says he has a baptism to undergo. Now the marriage of fire and water might seem to us like a mixed metaphor. But if you look in the Old Testament, it actually is a very common way in which the Hebrew Scriptures describe to us the judgment of God. So in the very second occurrence of the Hebrew word for fire, which is ash, it's joined to the image of liquid. In Genesis chapter 19, in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, it says that the Lord rained, the Hebrew verb matar is used there, he rained fire, ash, down upon these cities. So matar and ash, rain and fire, already in Genesis 19 are joined together. So the image of destruction, of judgment, is depicted for us in terms of fire and in terms of water. Also, if you look at the book of Psalms, you have the image joined there as well, because God says that he's going to take a cup and he's going to make the wicked drink this in judgment. Well, what's in the cup? Fire is in the cup. Fire and burning and scorching wind have been poured into this cup, and this is what the wicked are forced to drink. So in the Old Testament, the drawing together of fire as judgment and liquid as judgment are frequently joined together. Throughout the Old Testament, we have various stories that are connected with fire in judgment. You have God raining down fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah. You have him causing fire to go forth to consume Nadab and Abihu in the book of Leviticus. You have God being the one who sends forth fire, who is enveloped in fire, who causes fire to fall upon the earth. So the image of fire and judgment coming upon the ground, upon the earth, upon people, is a very frequent Old Testament image. But then Jesus says he has a baptism to undergo. Now, this is an Old Testament way also of expressing judgment, because throughout the Psalms we have one who's in distress, one who's being persecuted, one who is enduring the wrath of God, being described as one who is sinking in the waves, or who is inundated, who has this breakers of the sea or the ocean falling upon him. So fire and water are joined together in various Old Testament texts to describe this judgment. So Jesus says that he's going to cast or kindle fire on the earth. It says, but he has a baptism to undergo. Now, what's he talking about? Well, very often what you have in the Gospels is the image of end-time judgment, this eschatological judgment, which in the Old Testament would be described in terms of fire or water, applied to the death of Christ. So that all these Old Testament stories about judgment finally come to their fruition in the judgment that falls upon the Son of God. So that's why Jesus describes his death as a baptism, because in the Old Testament, to be inundated with the judging waters of God is a typical way in which the Old Testament speaks. So when Jesus talks about a baptism that he has to be baptized with, he's talking about his coming crucifixion. When he comes to cast fire upon the earth, he's talking about the fire of judgment that actually is going to befall him in his death. So all these Old Testament judgment stories, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the flood waters that fall during the days of Noah, the various fire and water stories from the prophets and from the Psalms, all of which depict this inundation, this burning fire of judgment that's going to befall the world, that already happens in the death of Jesus. So his death is a fiery judgment. His death is a watery judgment. These two are joined together to describe what happens to him on the day in which he is condemned, he is judged, in order that he might make all of us who are in him free of condemnation. So you have this Old Testament background of what's going to happen in the death of Jesus described in terms of fire and in terms of water. But there's more. Jesus says, do you think that I've come to bring peace on the earth? No, but I've come to bring division. And then he uses a very concrete example of this division. He talks about division within a family, a fractured family of 5, in which the son is against the father, and the father against the son, the mother against the daughter against the mother-in-law against the daughter-in-law against the mother-in-law. Now, what's significant is, very significant, is that Jesus, when he talks about this family division, isn't just coming up with an example off the cuff, as it were. He's actually quoting a verse from the prophet Micah in chapter 7, verse 6. And this verse this particular Old Testament verse is probably the most important verse in context in order to understand what Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 12. Because what's happening in Micah chapter 7 is this. Micah, in a typical prophetic fashion, is talking about the day of the Lord that is to come. And in the verses preceding Micah chapter 7, verse 6, he's talking about how he's gone looking for anyone who's righteous. He looks among the rich, he looks among the poor, he looks among the powerful, he looks among the weak of society, and he can't find a single righteous person. So this is a prophetic way of describing the fractured nature of society and of humanity, that everything has come unraveled. And Micah wraps up this discussion by using the image of a fractured family that Jesus himself quotes in Luke chapter 12. So Jesus is like the apostles did. He's pulling from the Old Testament in order to describe what's going to happen. Now, what's important to realize is that Micah chapter 7, verse 6, that talks about this fractured family, is used in various contemporaneous Jewish texts to describe what is going to happen when the Messiah comes. So Micah 7 verse 6 was understood to be a messianic text, that is a description of what it's going to be like in society when the Messiah comes. We have this in the Enoch literature, we have this in Jubilees, we have this also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have this also in a little bit later Jewish text. It's from the Midrash Rabbah. It's the commentary on the Song of Songs, in which Micah 7:6 is quoted as applying to the days of the Messiah. So Jesus is pulling from a well-known messianic text to describe what's going to happen on the coming day of the Lord. Now, Micah goes on after verse 6 to describe how after this judgment falls, in the day of the coming of the Lord, God is also going to work forgiveness and life and redemption for his people. I encourage you to read all of Micah chapter 7 because the whole chapter is significant for understanding what Jesus is communicating here. So he's saying, based on Micah and based on all the other Old Testament images of fire and water, he's saying this: the day of the Lord is coming in me. It's going to come when a fire is kindled on the earth. It's going to come when I endure a watery judgment called baptism. It's going to come when there's a fracturing of the family that Micah, the prophet, talks about. And what's going to happen in this day of the Lord is that I am going to be the one who endures the fiery judgment. I'm going to be the one who endures the watery deluge of judgment. And what's going to happen as a result of this, based upon what Micah says, is that this judgment is going to be consumed by me. I'm going to be the one who endures this, and as a result, forgiveness is going to be given to the remnant of the people of God, as it talks about in the rest of Micah chapter 7. So Jesus is drawing together material from Genesis 19, from Micah chapter 7, from the Psalms, and he's reflecting many of the Jewish texts that are contemporaneous with him in order to describe what's going to happen in his crucifixion. Because in a way, the end has already come. The end time judgment has already come in the death of Jesus, because what happens in that is that all the Old Testament stories of judgment are funneled down to fit into the crucifixion of Jesus, so that in him now the judgment of God has been taken care of. So that now, as Paul will say, there's no condemnation, there's no judgment for those who are in Christ Jesus. So I hope this Old Testament background has helped you to better understand what is being communicated in these few verses from Luke chapter 12. Once again, it's extremely important that when we're reading the New Testament, we read it in light of the Old Testament, because this provides the layered theological background to help us understand what is being communicated in the New Testament. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I pray that when you hear this text read or preached on Sunday, that you'll have a better understanding of it, a deeper understanding of it, and may God bless your meditations upon His Word. Thanks.